Welcome. This is camp week, so we're going to have a little bit fewer numbers today, but we're glad you're here. If you have your Bible, turn to 1 Corinthians 10, where we're continuing our study of 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians 10 can be divided into three sections, probably other ways to divide it, but I'm going to look at it that way. First of all, verses 1 through 13, you have the example of Israel and their failure to enter into the promised land, their example of apostasy, falling away, not pleasing God. And then verses 14 through 22 is a specific warning to flee idolatry. And then in verses 23 through 33 are some concluding remarks about meat sacrificed to idols. All of this, of course, linked together, going back to chapter 8 particularly. And then last week, we, in chapter 9, concluded with the Apostle Paul saying, I'm running in such a way as not boxing against the air or without aim. I am running to win the prize. I am running in order to get the crown, get the reward at the end of the race, so that I will not be disqualified. What a shame if after I've preached to others, I myself would be disqualified from getting the prize that is offered in Christ Jesus. So that's how chapter 9 ends, and that runs us right into chapter 10. So before we look there, I just think it's worthwhile to turn to 2 Timothy chapter 4. So Paul ends chapter 9 saying, I don't want to miss out on the prize. And then when you get to the end of 2 Timothy, he's writing some of his last words. And he has, of course, these familiar words to say. He says, I'm already being poured out as a drink offering, for the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I finished the course. I have kept the faith. And in the future there's laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. And not only to me, but also to all that love his appearing. So here he is writing to these brethren saying, I'm not going to miss out on the prize. And now he's lived and done all the things that we know about his marvelous life. He's coming to the end, and he's been faithful to his charge, faithful to his Lord. He's looking forward now to crossing the finish line and not missing out. And that's what he wanted for the brethren at Corinth. That's what he wanted for all of those that he had known and loved, that they too would finish the prize. And it's not unless we understand the full weight of what's at stake as we come into chapter 10 that you really can understand what this is about, what Paul is warning about. This is not just about losing out or matters of doesn't make much difference where you fall on this line. It's not that. That's not what he's concerned about. This is life or death matters that Paul is trying to weigh for these brethren. Sort of in this, all of this discussion is things we've been talking about. I think about Paul and Barnabas when they were getting ready to go on their second journey, and Barnabas wanted to take who? Mark. He said, let's go, let's get together, let's go. Paul said, what? No, nope, not going to take Mark. And so, it wasn't a big deal. What does it say that arose between them in Acts 15? Yeah, a disagreement. Well, yeah, it was a disagreement. A sharp disagreement. I don't know what that would be like. Especially, this is Paul and Barnabas. This is the Barnabas that Paul couldn't get into the church until Barnabas introduces him and takes a chance. And this is men who've traveled and risked their lives together, but a sharp disagreement arose, and what happens? They went their separate ways. That's the language that's there. They're separate. Paul takes Silas, and Barnabas takes Mark. He goes to Cyprus. Paul goes off in a different direction, and they never spoke again. Is that what you take that to mean? No. That's not what happened. You can rest assured that's not what happened. So as you try to look at that, Paul said, I'm not taking Mark. I'm not going with them. Why? What was that Paul was doing with regard to Mark? And what they were deciding to do. He was making a what? Judgment. He was making a judgment. That's what he was doing. He was saying, look, I don't have confidence in Mark. What's at stake? Souls were at stake. What else? Their lives were at stake. Somebody's going to have to drag me out of that, out from under those rocks. When I get stoned or when I get taken into prison, somebody's going to have to wash the stripes on my back after I've been beaten. And Mark cannot be trusted to be that guy. He left us in Pamphylia. He went back home because the things got tough. And I just don't trust Mark enough to go. Barnabas thought better of Mark. He had more confidence in him. Now, we know from other places, why was that true? He was a nephew or a cousin. They were related. And all that means is he may have known him a little better. He had more trust. He still had more confidence that Mark could come through. Paul simply didn't have that. And he wouldn't give in. he wouldn't change his mind. And it rose to, you can sort of say Barnabas saying, look, I know this young man. I know he's sorry, he let us down. He's regretted that. He says it's not going to happen. You can and Paul said, no. And Barnabas said, yes. And Paul said, well, if he's coming, I'm not going. And Barnabas said, he's coming. And then Paul said, well, I'm going then by myself, or I'm taking someone else. You go that way. And it was heated, is what is indicated. Sharp disagreement. And yet, as you look at 2 Timothy, Paul's writing those last words. And what does he say? What does he tell? Verse 11. Only Luke is with me. Do what? Pick up Mark. Pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he's useful to me for service. I don't know all that. I know in Colossians he also says, look, when Mark gets there, you welcome him. Instructions have already been given for you to welcome. Already there was a change in Paul's view in regard to Mark and his trustworthiness. But it's not just Paul who had changed. Can you imagine Luke saying, don't waste my time, Paul. Mark is never going to come. He's not forgotten what you and Barnabas disagreed about. He's not going to come here. You think Mark's going to come? He says, you want me to go see that old, grumpy old, he's got no confidence in me. No. That isn't what happened. So there was a disagreement. Paul had lost his confidence in Mark. There was too much at stake in Paul's mind to entrust him. Barnabas said, I will give him this opportunity. They went their separate ways, but I can assure you that when they bowed their heads in prayer, that Paul was praying for Barnabas and Mark to be successful. And Paul would have been praying for the gospel to grow, and that Mark would stand firm, that he wanted that to happen. And Paul and Mark would have prayed for Paul, and they would have been rejoicing in their success. No one, certainly Paul would not have said, I just can't wait to be able to tell Barnabas, I told you so. That would not have crossed his mind. He would have regretted it if what he thought was true. So my point is, you can have those kinds of disagreements. Those times may come. There may be times when you even say, look, then you go this way, I'm going that way. I can't follow you. I don't have confidence in what's happening here. That may happen. But in 1 Corinthians 10, what's at stake? The unity of the church, but something more is being warned about than just unity. What's Paul said, I don't want to lose? If you follow the example of the Israelites in 1 Corinthians 10, where do you wind up? Lost. We'll be going separate ways, but the separate ways of 1 Corinthians 10 is, I'm going to heaven. I'm finishing this course. You stay behind. You go this direction. You're going to lose your reward. That's what's at stake in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. It's important to understand that there are things that may not be compromised. So Paul begins this chapter, and it's an interesting thing. He's writing to what kind of church primarily? Who are they made up of, would you say, primarily? Gentiles. Gentile church. And yet he's going to use Israel as an example. And I'm sure they were acquainted now with the story of Israel. They are an example for everybody, but particularly he draws on two events. And there are two things in this chapter that the Corinthians were well acquainted with. And it has nothing to do with this. What were those two things that every Christian should be well acquainted with? If you're a Christian, you've already experienced from the very beginning one thing. What's that? Baptism. Every Christian has experienced that. They know that. They've been taught that, and they've received it. And every Christian also every week experiences what else? Lord's Supper. The Corinthians understood baptism, and they understood the Lord's Supper. Now listen, because to me that's critical. These are two critical, sometimes they're called sacraments, whatever you want, but they are two events in which we partake of Christ. We commune with Him. And Paul is going to use those two things to build on in terms of warning these Corinthians. So he says, I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And they all ate the same spiritual food, and they all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Now let me ask you, when you go back and read the Old Testament story, if you'd never read the New Testament, would you come away saying, look, they're being baptized? Would you get that? No. you wouldn't get that reading the Old Testament story. You wouldn't say, oh, look, they're drinking from Christ. And Moses struck the rock and Christ popped out. No. Paul is using the story, and he's bringing out greater meaning for us here, because they did understand what baptism was. And the reality is, that is what was happening. And Paul looks back and he says, look, the cloud overshadowed them and the seas on either side, they were baptized. When they crossed the Red Sea, they were leaving bondage behind and they were going into freedom, into the promised land that God had given to them. They were committing to Moses as their leader and they were being baptized into him. Once they got on the other side, they were no longer in Egypt. They were now headed for the promised land. That's the imagery. And the Corinthians would have said, I get it. I don't know. I know what you mean, Paul, because I understand when I was baptized into Jesus Christ, I was leaving an old world behind. I was coming up out of the waters, now no longer in that world, heading to heaven with Jesus Christ. There was a separation there. They would have understood exactly what Paul was saying. Now I'm on this road. I may be in a wilderness, but I'm on this path to heaven. And so they understood that. The Lord's Supper, they ate and drank. When you take the Lord's Supper, what are you proclaiming? Lots of things. You're proclaiming the Lord's death till He comes. You're proclaiming that He was raised up, that He's coming again. But what are you saying about yourself when you take the Lord's Supper? What are you saying? When we all eat this supper this morning, what are we saying? When we take the bread and we take the fruit of the vine, what are we saying to the world? Yeah. I believe it all. And I'm saying, not only do I believe it, I'm part of it. I'm taking my stand with Jesus. I am partaking of Him, His body, His blood. I'm all in. I'm with Him. We're making a declaration. It may be true somebody's going to eat that supper unworthily today. And by that, I'm not saying that they've done something sinful this week and they've been sorry for it. I'm saying they don't mean it. They haven't thought about who Jesus is. They haven't thought about what He stands for, what it means to be His disciple. They're just taking it, but they're not saying what you're saying and what I'm saying, at least what we should be saying, and that is, I am His disciple. I'm following Him. As the Israelites followed Moses, I'm following Jesus. Wherever He may lead, I'm following Him. I partake of Him. And so Paul begins this chapter saying, the entire nation of Israel, the whole nation was baptized into Moses. They were delivered. They were all set free. They all ate the same spiritual bread, right? They all drank from the same God-provided water. He said what they were really drinking of was Christ, because He's the hope of Israel, past, present, and future. Where they were headed was not merely a land. They were headed into a relationship with God. And who makes that clear in John 6? Jesus, right? He says, remember they said, well, Moses gave our fathers bread. And Jesus said, no, He didn't. God gave your father bread. And then what does He say? He's giving you bread right now. We sing that song, bread of heaven. It's me. Here's the bread. You're going to have to eat my body, drink my blood. You're going to have to partake of me if you want to have fellowship, communion with God. You're going to have to partake of me. I am the living water. So they all were baptized into Moses. They all ate and drank. He's talking about baptism and the Lord's Supper. They understood partaking of Jesus, what it all meant. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. And these things happened as examples for us, that we should not crave evil things as they craved, And do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it's written, the people sat down to eat and drink and stood up to play. Nor act immorally, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day. Nor let us try the Lord, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the serpents. Nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, and they're written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you, but such as is common to man. And God is faithful, and will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, that you may be able to endure it. They were all baptized, they all partook, but most of them didn't get what? Yeah, 2. And then they didn't get the reward. They didn't make it. Most of them didn't make it. So he's telling these Corinthians, just like you, they were all baptized. Just like you, they all ate and drank of God's provisions. Now don't be like them, because most of them didn't make it. He said, well, why didn't they make them? It wasn't God's unfaithfulness. He says, here, brethren, these things will keep you from getting your reward. You want to know what will keep you out of heaven? Don't crave evil things like they craved. Don't lust after evil things. That's a clear reference to the pagan festivals that were characterized by drunkenness and lasciviousness and immoral behavior. He's saying, look, you look at that and say, wow, look, they're having a party. Hey, everybody, I know these people are going to camp, but I can't think. What's that? Let's all go to Burning Man. Is that what it's going? Out in the day. Anybody there? Hey, we're getting up a crowd. Let's all go. It looks like they're having a great time there. You may look at, woo, boy, they're having a party. I wish I could go, but I'd have to change. I have to use an alias. Just as sure as the world, I'd be out there cavorting, and if somebody would take their camera and, I saw on my news feed, there's a guy out there that looked just like you. Really? Don't crave evil things, brethren. Don't look and say, that looks like a lot of fun. I'm missing out. Be careful. Nor try the Lord, or grumble as some of them did. The first is a reference to Numbers 21, when they were complaining about their food. Now here's the interesting thing about Numbers 21. Numbers 21 opens, the first 4 verses, a Canaanite king was coming after them, and looks like he was going to have his way. He took some of them captive and had defeated them. And so King Arad is being successful. And what do the people do? What do they always do when they're in trouble in the Old Testament? Yeah, like, Lord, help us. Help me, Lord. And what happened? The Lord heard and delivered them. Right there. And right after that, if you're wondering what the big deal, right after that, verses 4 and 5 says, then they set out from Mount Hor by way of the Red Sea to go around the land of Egypt, and the people became impatient because of the journey, and the people spoke against God and Moses. Why have you brought us out of Egypt into this wilderness to die? There's no food or water, and we loathe this miserable food. That's remarkable. I'm just going to tell you, on this journey to heaven, sometimes it's going to be long and hard. That's all I can tell you. Sometimes that's the way the journey's going to be. Sometimes you're going to be in a place where you're saying, I'm miserable right now. How much longer do I have to endure this? Maybe we'll say, if God expects me to He can just, kind of revealing, isn't it? You know, when you were praying and God heard your prayer and delivered you, and you said, thank you, Lord. Now you're saying, hi, Lord. He heard that too. And so, be careful. You know, when do people grumble? When do they grumble? Yeah, upset. Think, not getting your way. When you feel like you're getting the short end of the stick, when you feel like you're being somehow mistreated, somehow it's not fair, it's not the way it should be. So the spies go into the land, they come out and they say, wow, these are giants over there. How are we going to defeat these? We're just grasshoppers. And what the people, yeah, this is horrible. Why'd you bring us here to die? And they spoke against God again and they said, let's choose a new leader. We're done with Moses. We're not going to follow Moses anymore. We're going to pick a new guy and we're going to follow him where? Back to Egypt. We're going back to Egypt. They didn't make it to the promised land. We're not talking about a misstep. We're not talking about a sin for which they were bitterly sorrowful, that they regretted deeply, they hated it, or overwhelming grief so that they were just in despair of saying, I'm so sorrowful, Lord, I don't know if I can keep going. We're not talking about that. This is rebellion. It's rebellion saying, I'm not going to follow Moses anymore. I'm not doing it anymore. If this is what's required, if this is the path, I'm just not going there anymore. I'm going back to Egypt. You know, the Hebrew writer, chapter 10, he says, look, if we go on sinning willfully, if you continue sinning willfully, if you've made up your mind, you don't care what Jesus says, you're going to keep going in this path of sin, there's no sacrifice that can help you. That's what he says. No longer a sacrifice for sins if you're going to do that. But he writes on, he says, brethren, I know you better. You gave up your property. You went to prison for the Lord. Some of you were taken into custody. He says, you're not giving up now, are you? I know you better than that. You're not of that kind. You're not of that sort. And he says, the Lord can be trusted. He's faithful. He'll come through. And we are not of those who shrink back to destruction. We're not going to shrink back. We're going on. I don't know maybe today you're thinking about shrinking back. Don't shrink back. Don't give up. Maybe the Lord's asking a lot of you. Sometimes he asks a lot of us. Sometimes he asks all there is of us. But he's faithful. Don't miss the reward. Then Paul says this, therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to wise men. You judge what I say. Is not the cup of blessing which we bless a sharing in the blood of Christ? Is not the bread which we break a sharing in the body of Christ? Since there's one bread, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one bread. Look at the nation of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifice sharers in the altar? What do I mean then? That a thing sacrificed to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything? No. But I say that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to become sharers in demons. You cannot drink of the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? We're not stronger than he, are we? Again, he's making his point using the Old Testament. Those who offered the sacrifices at the altar in the Old Testament, what did they do with the meat? Well, some went back to the worshiper because they ate at the table. Some, the priest, what did he do? He got to eat. The priests eat of it, and then what happened to the rest? Who ate that? Someone else ate at that table. Who was it? What happened to the other part of it? Laid on the altar? What happened? Got burned? And the smoke goes up, and who's eating that food? God is. God's there. They're sharing the food. They're at the table. They're all at God's table eating of the meal that's been provided. That's the imagery here. When we come here this morning, you're eating, I'm eating. Who else is eating at this table? The Lord is. He said, I'll eat it with you again anew in my kingdom. Make no mistake, we call it communion for a reason. Partakers, we're partaking together with the Lord, of the Lord. That's the imagery, and he's drawing on that. He says, that's the table. And he says, well, when you go to the idol's table, you say, well, there's no God behind the idol. I know that. Don't you know there's only, how many gods are there? One. So I know that. Yeah, there's just one God. You're right about that. There is no God behind the idol, but who is behind the idol? Demons. Satan. He says, that's Satan's table you're sitting at. When you sit at the table of evil, wickedness, things that are of this nature, he says, no, I'm not worried about that. You're the God behind it. I'm worried about the devil behind it. And you got to decide whose kingdom you want to be in. There's no dual citizenship, folks. There are only two kingdoms. Kingdom of light and darkness, the kingdom of good and evil, kingdom of life and death. You have to decide what table you want to eat at. And if you're going to sit at the demon's table, you partake with demons, but you can't come then and sit at the Lord's table and partake of his table. That's impossible. That's what he's saying. Flee idolatry. Brethren, some things we just have to flee. Just run from it. All aspects of it. Flee immorality, we are told. Flee that. Don't get close to it. Don't have anything to do with it. We need to flee these things. And so don't partake. I don't know what was going on in these idol temples that they wanted to partake, but other than the evil things, but he says don't partake of these things at all. You don't need to be there. So some of them were going to the temple's tables, thinking because I know better. No, Paul says, no, you don't know better. You wouldn't be there. Not there. That's not where we belong. And there's some places, folks, we just don't belong. And then he closes with these final words. All things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful, but not all things edify. Let no one seek his own good, but that of his neighbor. Eat anything that is sold in the meat market without asking questions for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. If one of the unbelievers invites you and you wish to go eat anything set before you without asking questions for conscience sake. But if anyone should say to you, this is meat sacrificed to idols, do not eat it, for the sake of the one who informed you, and for conscience sake. I mean, not your own conscience, but the other man's. For why is my freedom judged by another man's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I slandered concerning that for which I give thanks? Whether then you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. Give no offense either to Jews or Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of the many that they may be saved. Let me just read this little section from J.B. Phillips. Now, why should my freedom to eat be at the mercy of someone else's conscience? Or why should any evil be said of me when I've eaten meat with thankfulness and have thanked God for it? Because whatever you do, eating or drinking or anything else, everything should be done to the glory of God. Do nothing that makes men stumble. Whether they're Jews or Greeks or members of the church of God, I myself adapt myself to all men without considering my own advantage, but their advantage, that if possible they may be saved. So we've already talked greatly about this, but two main principles Paul says when it comes to this. Number one, let no one seek his own good, but that of his neighbor. And number two, whether then you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it to the glory of God. You know, we're going to an amusement park. Hey, Bruce, we're all getting together, we're planning a family trip. And somebody says, with all of the groups together, my family just doesn't like amusement parks. Okay, if we want everyone to go, what do we need to do? Choose something else. Now, does that mean no one ever gets to go to the amusement park? No, it doesn't mean that. It just means that if we want to do it all together, we make that accommodation. Okay, we can do something else. Oh, maybe someone says, I'm sorry, I can't go to that park because, you know, they take a stand for this particular issue. I just can't do that. I can't support them. It's just an amusement park. We're just going to ride rides. Okay, what? Your conscience bothers you about that? We'll go to another. Is there somewhere else we can go? Let's go there. What if your neighbor says, I'm going to that park because they stand for this despicable thing that you say, that's a despicable thing, and what would you say there? I'm out. I'm sorry. Because I don't want you to think I support that thing that you know. So that's what's happening here. No cause. I don't know, maybe the best meat that was in the marketplace was from the temples. Everybody knew it. The Temple of Diana, it got the best meat in town. So your neighbor, he wants you to know you're getting the best meat in town. What's he say? Temple of Diana, I picked that up this morning. I'm sorry, I can't eat. It's not my conscience. I'm free to eat meat. I know it's just meat, but I'm looking out for you. I don't want you to take a misstep. I'm not going to do that. Don't ask. Give thanks. If there's no issue, enjoy your meat. Your conscience is not, you're not limited by everyone else's conscience. Only when you perceive that someone may be misled, someone may stumble. Because you love people and want them to finish the course and go to heaven, you make choices to help them. And we do that willingly. It's not because we must. We do that because we have made a judgment in their favor. That's all that is involved here in 1 Corinthians 10. God bless you. We'll pick up God enabling with 11 next week.